In the shadow of dusk, an unassuming letter arrives at Ethan Miller's desk. The envelope is plain, the handwriting unremarkable, yet something about it sends a chill down his spine. As an investigative journalist with a nose for the bizarre and unexplained, Ethan has seen his share of hoaxes, haunted houses, and urban legends spun by small towns desperate for attention. But this invitation is different. There's no return address, no contact information, just a single line signed by someone calling themselves the Watcher. The letter is brief. If you truly seek the truth, come to Ravenswood. Ravenswood. He's heard the name in passing, whispered among locals as a forgotten town, one that clings to the edge of memory like a dark shadow. Rumors of curses and disappearances swirl around it, urban legends so deeply embedded that most steer clear without asking why. Ethan brushes it off as a hoax, perhaps a stunt to scare him. Yet, as he digs deeper, he finds traces of the town's history intertwined with tales of missing people, unexplained deaths, and strange occurrences stretching back more than a century. Despite his skepticism, he feels drawn to Ravenswood, his curiosity piqued by its sinister allure. It's a story that could put his name on the map, an opportunity to prove himself in the industry. There's an undeniable pull, a dark invitation that he can't ignore. This town, he thinks, could finally be the one to shake his disbelief and prove the existence of something truly supernatural. As he drives toward Ravenswood, he notices the landscape shift. The trees seem to grow denser, their shadows longer and darker, as though the town itself is hidden from the rest of the world. The sun dips below the horizon, casting an eerie glow on the road, and an unsettling silence fills the air. There are no signs, no markers, just a sense of entering a place removed from time, untouched by the rules of the outside world. His phone loses signal, his GPS goes blank, and an instinctive dread fills him. When he finally arrives, he is met with a town that feels frozen, as though it's waiting. Ravenswood appears to be a place forgotten by the modern world, yet it carries an oppressive aura, as though the very ground holds the weight of countless secrets. Its streets are empty, its houses aged and shrouded in silence, and every window seems to watch him with unseen eyes. As he walks through the town, a lingering sense of something sinister crawls beneath his skin, a darkness that whispers promises and warns of danger. He notices small, peculiar things, a shadow darting in the corner of his vision, whispers that dissipate as soon as he tries to listen, and townsfolk who avoid his gaze, their eyes dull and haunted. Each person he speaks with gives only cryptic responses, alluding to the conclave, the Watcher, and the legends that plague Ravenswood. It becomes clear that this place, with its eerie quiet and ghostly residents, is hiding something, and if he isn't careful, he might just become its next victim. Ethan Miller stepped off the bus, his journalist instincts kicking in as he took his first steps into Ravenswood. The town seemed stuck in a different era, with faded storefronts and streets veiled by an ever-present mist. It was as though the town itself had been pulled out of time, preserved in a warped reality. Local eyes followed him warily as he walked along the cracked pavement, whispers fading as he passed, adding to the tension thrumming in the air. The trail of stories he'd unearthed about Ravenswood was a peculiar one. It was said that the town had been founded in the early 1800s by a secretive group known only as the Conclave. The Conclave, Ethan read in dusty newspaper clippings, were believers in dark rituals, keepers of secrets no outsider was ever meant to uncover. Legends hinted that they had bound a dark force to protect the town, though this so-called protection seemed more like a curse to those who dared to look too closely. Ethan's first stop was the town's library, a foreboding building standing apart from the others. Its massive stone facade loomed over him, casting long shadows in the dim afternoon light. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and mildew. An elderly librarian, her gaze sharp despite her frail appearance, watched him with an intensity that made him uneasy. Looking for something specific, are you? She asked, her voice a brittle whisper that echoed in the silence. Ethan offered a polite nod, trying to ease her suspicion. Just interested in learning more about the town's history. Some histories are better left forgotten, she murmured, barely audible, before shuffling away. Ignoring her words, Ethan began his search. The town's archives were tucked away in a dim corner of the library. A sign over the door read restricted access, but the door stood slightly ajar, beckoning him forward. Inside, rows of dusty shelves held the remnants of a past filled with secrets. He traced his fingers over book spines, their titles obscured by dust and age, until he found a ledger marked records of the Conclave. The first entries detailed the formation of the Conclave, a group that included some of Ravenswood's wealthiest families. The ledger chronicled their early gatherings, their experiments with ancient rituals, and their obsession with binding something dark and powerful to the town. Each entry grew more disturbing, filled with cryptic symbols and references to the offering and the binding. In the middle of his research, a soft voice broke the silence. "You shouldn't be in here." Ethan turned to see the librarian, standing in the doorway, her expression one of grave concern. "Many have tried to uncover our town's past, Mr. Miller. None succeeded, and most disappeared." Her words lingered, a clear warning. But for Ethan, they only deepened his curiosity. He slipped the ledger back into its place and left the library, the librarian's caution ringing in his ears as he made his way to his motel. The shadows seemed to stretch, trailing him along the dim streets, almost as if the town itself was warning him to turn back. The following day, Ethan began asking locals about the legends that clung to Ravenswood. He found himself in the town's only diner, its booths filled with patrons who kept their voices low. His attempts to strike up conversation were met with averted gazes and half-hearted responses, until he mentioned the Whispering Woman. "Best keep away from the forest," muttered an elderly man at the counter, glancing nervously at the window as though she might be watching. "Men have been lured out there, led by her voice, and none have come back the same." Another woman chimed in, her face pale as she spoke. "They say she only comes for those who dig too deep. You'll hear her voice first, soft, gentle, and before you know it, she'll be right beside you, whispering your name." Intrigued, Ethan probed further, but a sudden hush fell over the diner. A young woman sitting alone at a corner table beckoned him over. She introduced herself as Clara, one of the few in town who didn't avoid him outright. With a furtive glance at the other patrons, she began to tell him about the Hollow Children. "Years ago, there was a tragedy," Clara said, her voice low. "A group of children disappeared, and their bodies were never found. Since then, people say they see the children wandering the streets at night, hollow-eyed and silent, as though waiting for something, or someone, to lead them home." Ethan listened intently, each story feeding his skepticism and curiosity in equal measure. But it was the mention of the spectral hounds that sent a shiver down his spine. Clara hesitated, visibly unnerved before describing them. "They're not just dogs," she whispered. "They're spirits bound to the land, protectors of the town's secrets. If you hear them, they're warning you. But if you see them, it means they've come for you." The unease in her voice was unmistakable, and Ethan couldn't dismiss it as mere superstition. That night, determined to uncover some proof, he ventured out, his camera ready. Shadows played tricks on his mind, seeming to ripple and shift, yet he saw no clear signs of the legends. Until, just as he passed the edge of the forest, he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, calling his name. He spun around, the forest dark and silent, but the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, and he felt a cold hand graze his shoulder. Gasping, he stumbled back, his heart pounding, but when he looked, there was no one there. Breathless, he returned to his motel, but the incident left him shaken. The legends he dismissed as mere stories were now reaching out to him, slowly pulling him into their dark grip. He tried to shake it off, but as he lay in bed, the events replayed in his mind, an ominous warning lingering. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of their story now. Ethan pushed through the dense underbrush, ignoring the chill that swept over him. The forest was darker here, with thick trees blocking most of the sunlight, leaving the ground in permanent shadow. The townsfolk's warnings rang in his ears, but curiosity propelled him forward. Stories about the Whispering Woman had been whispered with such fear, and he couldn't resist the urge to seek the truth behind the legend. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the air became. It felt as though the very trees were watching him, their branches twisting like skeletal hands reaching out. Then, without warning, the forest grew silent. The usual hum of insects and rustling of leaves ceased, leaving only an unnatural quiet that made his heart pound. Ethan, the whisper was so faint he thought he imagined it, but the voice grew louder, carrying an almost pleading tone. He spun around, his eyes darting between the trees. There, just a few feet away, stood a figure, her form barely visible, a woman in a tattered, ethereal gown that clung to her translucent body. Her eyes were empty, hollow voids that seemed to draw him in. "Come with me," she murmured, her voice laced with a haunting melody that tugged at his mind. Ethan took a step back, his pulse racing. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but the woman's gaze held him in place. She drifted closer, her movements as smooth and silent as the mist around her feet, her arm extending as if inviting him into the depths of the forest. "Come," she repeated, her voice more insistent. "There's so much to show you." It took all his strength to break her gaze, to turn away from her hollow eyes. He staggered back, tripping over roots and scrambling to put distance between them. Yet her voice followed him, filling his ears, echoing through his mind as if she had imprinted herself onto his very thoughts. He ran until he burst through the tree line and back into the sunlight. But even as he stopped to catch his breath, he felt her presence lingering, like a stain on his soul. From that moment on, Ethan was not alone. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, and every time he was alone, he could hear her voice, a whisper just beyond the threshold of hearing. "Ethan," she called over and over in a tone that shifted from seductive to sinister, a constant reminder that he was marked, hunted by something beyond this world. That night, driven by a compulsion he couldn't ignore, Ethan wandered the streets of Ravenswood after midnight. The town was unsettlingly quiet, the usual life drained from its streets, leaving an eerie emptiness that made him feel like he was the last person alive. But then he heard it, a faint giggle, followed by the sound of light footsteps on cobblestone. As he turned a corner, he saw them, a small group of children, their eyes hollow, their faces expressionless, moving silently through the streets. Their clothes looked worn from a different era, and their movements were jerky, like puppets on invisible strings. Despite the darkness, their pale skin seemed to glow, a cold, ghostly light surrounding them. Ethan followed, unable to look away. The children moved in single file, heads lowered, their gaze fixed on the ground. Every now and then, one would turn, and he'd catch a glimpse of their eyes, empty, soulless, black pits that made his blood run cold. They seemed to drift more than walk, their steps making no sound as they moved. The children led him to an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town, its windows shattered and its walls cloaked in ivy. It loomed over him like a silent sentinel, a relic of a forgotten time. The children stopped at the doorway, their faces turning towards him in unison. There was a sadness in their eyes now, a deep, ancient sorrow that tugged at his heart. Inside, the house was filled with the whispers of the past, echoes of laughter that had long since faded. Ethan moved cautiously through the hall, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The walls were lined with faded portraits, eyes watching him with silent judgment. He sensed he was walking through a mausoleum, a place where time had frozen, trapping the souls of the innocent. In the center of the room, he found a small, makeshift altar, and on it lay children's toys. Old dolls, toy soldiers, small trinkets, arranged with an unsettling reverence. His stomach churned as he realized the truth. These weren't just toys. They were offerings, left for the children who had been taken, sacrificed by the conclave in their twisted ritual to keep the town safe. A sharp, cold gust swept through the room, and the children appeared again, surrounding him, their hollow eyes fixed on his own. For the first time, he felt the weight of their sorrow, the anguish of young lives stolen and souls bound to this haunted place. He tried to speak, to apologize, to offer something, but his voice was gone, choked by the weight of their despair. One child stepped forward, a young boy no older than 10, his face pale, his lips a faint blue. He raised a hand, pointing towards the shadows at the back of the room. Ethan followed his gaze, and saw a dark figure, a robed silhouette, face hidden, watching him with a silent, menacing presence. The figure was the embodiment of the Conclave's dark force, a guardian that fed on the souls of the town's children. Ethan backed away, his body trembling with terror. The children watched him with sad resignation, their faces fading as the darkness crept closer, consuming them one by one until only their hollow gazes remained, floating in the air. The last to vanish was the young boy, his hand reaching out as if begging Ethan to free them. When Ethan stumbled out of the house, gasping for air, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The whispers of the children faded with the night, but the memory of their hollow eyes and the dark figure in the shadows lingered, haunting him. He knew now that he had seen the true face of Ravenswood's curse, a twisted legacy built on the souls of the innocent, bound to protect a town that had long since forgotten its humanity. The library was cloaked in shadows as Ethan rifled through a stack of dusty, old records and ancient tomes. Hours had slipped away as he pored over brittle pages filled with symbols, cryptic notations, and names that had long since faded from memory. There was something sinister hidden within these pages. He could feel it in his bones, yet he hadn't found the evidence he needed to tie everything together. Then, behind a row of tightly shelved books, his fingers brushed against the leather-bound edge of a journal. It was fragile, its cover worn and faded, but as he opened it, he realized it held the secrets he'd been searching for. The first page was inscribed with a name, Elias Crowley, a former member of the Conclave. Ethan's heart hammered as he read through the journal, its pages filled with Crowley's confessions and haunting memories of the town's dark rituals. The Conclave, it seemed, was far more than an ancient society. They were the keepers of an unholy pact. According to Crowley, Ravenswood had long been protected by a malevolent force, an entity bound to the town by blood sacrifices and shrouded in secrecy. This entity's power was bound to Ravenswood through ritualistic deaths, each carefully orchestrated to appease it, to sustain it. As Ethan read, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. Crowley described the Conclave's initiation process, where new members were taken to the forest depths, led by torches to an ancient stone altar. There, they would witness the binding ceremony, an unholy communion between the living and the dead, cementing the town's pact. The journal mentioned the legends Ethan had heard, the whispering woman, the hollow children, the spectral hounds. But these weren't mere stories, Crowley wrote. They were guardians, entities created by the Conclave through forbidden rites to protect the town and enforce its curse. Each legend, each terrifying figure, was bound to Ravenswood's dark heart. Outsiders like Ethan were considered a threat, a potential disturbance in the delicate balance the town relied on. If they stayed too long, the legends would awaken, hunting them, feeding off their fear until they became part of the town's history. Another tale for the townsfolk to whisper. Ethan's hands shook as he turned the pages. The final entry was a warning, a desperate plea from Crowley. To anyone who finds this, leave now. Once you are marked, you cannot escape. The Conclave's price is steep, and there is no mercy here. Ravenswood's protector does not forgive. It does not forget. The reality of his danger crashed over him, pressing down on his chest. He was no longer an outsider. He was marked. The legends, the whispers, the shadows. Everything was now reaching out to him, pulling him closer to a fate he could not escape. Ethan knew he had little time left. If he stayed, he would become another story, another warning. His name added to Ravenswood's haunted history. Ethan lay awake that night, his mind churning with images he couldn't shake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Crowley's journal, the warnings etched into his brain like a curse. Exhausted, he felt sleep pulling him under. Yet when he surrendered to it, he found no peace. The nightmares came swiftly. He was back in the forest, the shadows twisting into ghastly faces, their empty eyes staring at him with malice. The whispering woman reached out, her cold hand grazing his cheek, sending a wave of terror through him. The hollow children stood around him, their hollow stares filled with accusation, their mouths moving silently in cries he couldn't hear. He woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat, his heart racing. Yet, the nightmare clung to him, like a second skin, the images refusing to fade. As he sat up, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye, a shadow slipping along the wall, twisting, contorting, until it almost took form. He blinked, and it was gone, but the sensation of being watched remained. Days blurred into nights, and Ethan felt himself slipping, as though reality was loosening its grip. Shadows followed him wherever he went, flickering in the corners of his vision, growing darker, more substantial. Whispers filled his ears. Even in the silence of his room, low, insistent voices urging him to give in, to surrender to the pull of Ravenswood's curse. And then came the Watcher. It started subtly, a feeling of eyes on his back, a creeping sense of dread that coiled around his heart. But soon, the Watcher made itself known. In his dreams, Ethan saw a figure draped in darkness, standing at the edge of his bed, observing him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The figure was silent, but its presence radiated a malevolent energy, a promise of torment if he dared to resist. One night, as he sat alone in his room, staring at the darkness that seemed to press against his window, he heard a voice, a deep, unsettling murmur, as if it were spoken from beyond the grave. Once marked, there is no escape. Ethan spun around, heart pounding, but no one was there. The room was empty, yet he could feel the Watcher's presence, as real as his own breath. He was losing his grip on reality, the line between what was real and what was legend fading with each passing day. His mind teetered on the edge, and he could feel himself slipping, his thoughts fragmented, torn between the urge to flee and the knowledge that he was already trapped. Sleep was a distant memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the legends, felt their cold touch, their silent judgment. The townsfolk's warnings echoed in his mind, but he was beyond reason, beyond escape. Ravenswood had him, body and soul. The Watcher appeared again, this time closer, standing just inches from his bed, its eyes invisible beneath a hooded shadow. Yet Ethan felt its gaze bore into his very soul. The figure leaned close, whispering in a voice like rustling leaves. "You are already part of Ravenswood, Ethan. The legends will consume you. There is no leaving now." Ethan felt a scream building within him, but it was swallowed by the darkness, leaving him in silence, his mind unraveling as he realized he was already becoming part of the legend. Another story for Ravenswood, another name lost to its curse. The air was thick with a stale, damp odor as Ethan descended into the heart of Ravenswood's hidden past. Each step down the winding stone staircase led him further from daylight and deeper into the shadows of the town's forbidden history. His flashlight flickered, casting jittery shadows across the moss-lined walls as he pushed onward, each step echoing with a hollow thud that seemed to amplify his fear. But he could feel the Watcher's presence pressing against him, almost guiding him down into this cryptic abyss, and he knew he could not turn back. At the bottom of the stairs, the air grew colder, as though he had crossed an invisible threshold into a realm where light had no place. Ethan found himself in a vast underground chamber, its walls lined with ancient, crude carvings, symbols of the Conclave's rituals and sigils meant to bind Ravenswood's dark force. The stone floor was littered with remnants of candles, broken pottery, and unrecognizable artifacts, each a relic of some past ritual. And there, at the chamber's center, stood the Watcher. Its figure was obscured, draped in darkness, so thick that Ethan could barely make out the shape of its head beneath the hooded shroud. The Watcher's gaze was as heavy as chains, a force that seemed to pull him down, rooting him to the spot. But Ethan squared his shoulders, refusing to look away, determined to confront this harbinger of his doom. He knew if he could sever this connection, break the curse, he might finally be free from Ravenswood's grasp. "Why me?" Ethan's voice echoed through the chamber, tinged with both fear and defiance. "Why does this town claim us? Why do you haunt me?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, a cold whisper seeped through the darkness. "Because you sought the truth, and the truth demands sacrifice." The words barely left the Watcher's lips before the darkness around Ethan began to shift, coalescing into distinct shapes, each more terrifying than the last. The whispering woman appeared first, her eyes blank yet piercing, her form translucent yet tangible. She drifted closer, her lips moving in a soft murmur only he could hear, drawing him toward her as though promising to reveal every secret he had sought. But he resisted, clenching his fists, forcing his gaze away. Then came the hollow children, their vacant eyes staring up at him, faces emotionless and blank. They reached out, their small, cold hands tugging at his clothes, their hollow whispers filling his ears, promising him eternal silence if he just let go. Ethan stumbled back, his heart racing as he fought off the compulsion to surrender. Then the spectral hounds appeared, their eyes glowing with a fierce hunger, their spectral forms circling him, teeth bared, snapping inches from his throat. The low growls sent shivers down his spine, their predatory energy pressing in from all sides, filling him with a dread he could barely contain. Desperately, he turned back to the Watcher, whose silent gaze held the weight of ages. The legends, these creatures, were manifestations of Ravenswood's curse, guardians woven from the town's darkest memories. And he was next, a story to be told, another legend to protect Ravenswood's hidden heart. But Ethan refused to let them claim him. Summoning every last shred of courage, he shouted, "I'm not yours to take. I choose my own fate." The Watcher's form shifted, its darkness growing, stretching until it seemed to fill the entire chamber, casting each legend in shadow. The air grew heavy, dense with an energy that made it impossible to breathe, as if the weight of all Ravenswood's secrets were bearing down on him, crushing him into submission. Yet within that final, suffocating moment, Ethan saw a crack in the darkness, a faint glimmer of light from the journal he still held in his hand. Crowley's words echoed in his mind, and he knew there was only one way to sever the bond. He had to renounce the fear, the lure of knowledge that had drawn him here. Taking a deep breath, he released the journal, watching as it fell into the shadow, the pages scattering into the darkness. The figures around him recoiled, their forms flickering, and for the first time, he saw a glint of something human in the Watcher's empty eyes, perhaps regret or pity. And then, one by one, the legends faded, their shadows receding back into the walls, swallowed by the ancient chamber. The Watcher was last, its form melting into the void, leaving only silence in its wake. As the shadows lifted, Ethan collapsed to his knees, feeling the weight of Ravenswood release him at last. He had survived, but as he looked around the empty chamber, he knew he would forever carry the scars of this place. He was free, but at a cost he could barely fathom, knowing the legends would live on, waiting patiently for the next soul brave or foolish enough to confront them. Ethan stumbles from Ravenswood, bruised and battered, his mind and body worn from his encounters with the legends. He doesn't know how he managed to escape, only that he is alive, and his heart is pounding as he speeds away from the cursed town. Relief floods him, but there's a nagging feeling at the back of his mind, an itch he can't quite reach. He doesn't feel quite real. He chalks it up to exhaustion, the trauma of what he endured in Ravenswood. Days pass, and he tries to resume his life, diving into work to drown out the memories. But the shadows follow him. At first, it's subtle, a flicker in the mirror, a whisper just beyond hearing. He dismisses it as paranoia, the residue of fear that Ravenswood instilled in him. But soon, the incidents escalate. He sees his reflection moving independently, a warped version of himself with eyes that hold no life. When he speaks, his voice seems to echo, distorted and hollow. One night, he wakes to find himself in his living room, staring out the window, though he has no memory of how he got there. The figure in the glass looks back at him with an expression that isn't his own, a twisted grin that chills him to the core. He tries to leave, to put distance between himself and whatever darkness lingers. But no matter where he goes, the shadows of Ravenswood are with him, a haunting reminder that he is marked. He begins to realize the horrific truth. He escaped the town, but Ravenswood never let him go. It's as if he's trapped in a reflection of his own life, one where he moves through his days like a ghost, unable to connect, unable to truly feel alive. Friends and family start to notice the change, their eyes filled with concern, but they can't reach him. He's slipping further away from the life he once knew, lost to the legends that claimed him. The final straw comes when he sees a stranger in the street, wide-eyed and frightened, staring at him as if he's seen a ghost. "You're him, aren't you?" the stranger whispers, voice trembling. "The man from Ravenswood, the one they say never left." As Ethan stands frozen, a sinking horror fills him. He has become part of Ravenswood, a living legend doomed to wander, his identity hollowed out and replaced by the town's curse. The last image we see is his face reflected in a storefront window, twisted and haunted, the whispers of Ravenswood echoing in his mind, sealing his fate as the newest chapter in the town's dark story. No one escapes Ravenswood. Not really. If you enjoyed tonight's spine-chilling stories, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss the next tale. Remember, when darkness falls, nothing is ever truly safe. Until we meet again, keep your lights dim, lock your doors tight, and never take your eyes off the shadows. You never know what's lurking out there, waiting for you.